what we'll take you through is 4 aspects. One will take you through the history of emotional intelligence, how it started, how it came to the forefront in the first place. We'll also take you through few of the models. These are little theoretical, but very, very important to understand. What are these models? And then we'll rather narrow it down on one model, that is Goleman's model, which is the simplest of all. And then, of course, we'll look at how we can use emotional intelligence to our advantage. That will be actually the key takeaway. What we can do with it. If emotional intelligence is important, can we do something about it? That would be our lookout as we progress through this webinar. So we'll move on. Next slide, I'm taking it to. I request. Yeah, so let's look at the brief history of emotional intelligence. The next, if you just can put the Shah, can, yeah.
No.
When we are looking at the conventional intelligence, normally we call it IQ. IQ has been something which has been revered, regarded for a very long time in the history. But in the last 60 years, 70 years, something changed. IQ is typically something related to memory, problem solving, logical reasoning, causality. We can find out cause and effect, or mathematical calculation. These are things which are typically attributed to what we call IQ. But what scientists and some of the social scientists, they found out is not necessarily IQ is leading to the higher level of effectiveness. Not necessarily it is making people successful. So there must be something else which is there in the background. And let's move on to the next click. So what happened in turn, the one psychologist in Harvard Business School, his name is Howard Gardner, he did a lot of research and finally he came up with a paper called Frames of Mind, Theory of Multiple Intelligences. And this inspired a lot of emotional intelligence study. So click on the next button, please. This is multiple intelligence is what is suggested, that normally we see people who are intelligent from the point of view of language, from mathematical skills, from analysis, they are supposedly intelligent. But Harvard Gardner proposed that there are more people, there are some people who are otherwise intelligent. Like some people are wonderful in music. They can understand tone, they can understand pitch of a music, they can look at or listen to a music and quickly decipher how the music has been composed. So this is another kind of intelligence. There are some people who are architects. They can look at a spatial place and say this kind of a design would help. Some is a fashion designer who would say this color with this kind of a design would be the best to wear for a person or for a lady. So these are not necessarily the IQ domain. So that was one thing that Harvard Gardner he brought up. He talked about 8 different intelligences, but 2 of them were most important and carried forward in a very structured way. And these 2 are, you can see there are 2. One is intrapersonal intelligence and interpersonal intelligence. That means a person's understanding about himself or herself and a person's understanding about people around him or her. So these are the 2 things which he says are very, very important. And from there generated, or the genesis of emotional intelligence is that the interpersonal and intrapersonal intelligence. We can go to the next. Then we look at the few models influenced by this, inspired by this study of Gardner. There are 3 people who started working on it. In fact, Salovey and Mayer, Peter Salovey and John Mayer, they started working on this and they coined the word emotional intelligence. Then Reuben Barron, another psychologist, he created a model. And finally, in 1995, Daniel Goleman, he came up with a book and which was extraordinarily famous all across. Now let me just invite you for a quick response on the chat box. I think all of you are seeing the chat box and you can be there. Just respond quickly. How many of you have heard about Daniel Goleman? How many of you know Daniel Goleman, or at least heard of the the name Daniel Goleman? Quickly, if you know it, say yes or why. Why is for yes. You know, you've heard of Daniel Goleman. Why Prashant Gavani saying why, Sonu Tanwar, why? Yeah, few more I'll wait for. Yeah, somebody says no, Swetanisha says no, 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 and few whys. Okay, let me give a brief about Daniel Goleman. Daniel Goleman was actually he was a person. He was not a scientist. He was from Harvard. Then after Harvard, he was a journalist in New York Times, typically in the area of psychology and in the area of science as well. He was writing a lot of scientific articles in New York Times. Later on, he came in contact with John Mayer and Peter Salovey, and he read their articles on emotional intelligence, and he was fascinated by this entire study. So he started doing research on this. And in 1995, Daniel Goleman came up with a book called Emotional Intelligence. The name of the book was Emotional Intelligence, and probably nothing in the past 30 years has influenced the psychology and behavioral science domain more than this book. This book, Emotional Intelligence, actually completely hijacked all other attention. So most of the work has been done in this domain. Now moving on, looking at these models, Peter Salovey and John Mayer's model, which talks about 4 different aspects: emotional perception, emotional integration, emotional understanding, and emotional management. We'll not get into the depth of all of this, but in brief, we can understand what they actually refer to. Emotional perception means we understand what is the emotion that I'm going through at this point in time, right at this point in time. What is the emotion? Emotional integration is a very interesting aspect, which talks about my thought knows my emotion. I know my emotion. I can, in a language, I can say, now I am sad, or now I am happy, or now I am anxious, or I am apprehensive. So that is more on the emotional integration. How the thought has been integrated, mapped onto my emotion. Emotional understanding, it is about understanding others' emotion, and managing emotion is about managing my emotion and others' emotion. Moving on to the next one is Byron's model, which is you can see the 2 things has been taken directly: intrapersonal and interpersonal skills. And Byron talked about something called adaptability. We have some emotion, but in a social context, when you're in our office or you're interacting with your spouse, sometimes you're feeling angry, but you are probably little taming yourself down and showing another emotion. So you are adapting to that scenario. That is known as adaptation or adaptability. Stress management, we'll discuss about this as we move on in this session. And general mood. We have, as you look at our biological clock in a day, we'll see our mood swings from happiness to sadness to a different scenario. We are anxious, sometimes we are little apprehensive about what is going to happen, or we are thinking about the past and ruminating about why this thing happened to me, little guilty. So there are so many emotions, they happen in a day, but some people have the ability to come out of certain unproductive emotion and get to a productive emotion or more advantaged emotion. So that's the general mood capability or ability. Now these are the models which are there, but we'll be focusing more on the last model, where we'll be completely narrowing on and discussing in depth. Also we'll be looking at how it can help us. Jyoti has a question: is it adaptability suppressing one's emotion? No, not necessarily. It is not necessarily suppressing emotion. It's a good question. It is about channelizing the emotion appropriately. Just quick example. When Gandhi was thrown out of a train in South Africa, he was terribly angry. He was extremely angry, but that time he channelized it to make it his strength. So what he did is, I'll not lose my temper and shout at somebody, rather than use that anger, hold that anger and make it a movement. So channelizing that anger is what adaptability is. It's not about suppressing it, and suppressing has other counter effect. It can impact your health badly. So it's not suppressing. Yeah, thank you for the question, Jyoti. Now moving on to the next wherein we see the Goleman model. It talks about 4 aspects. I'll not discuss right now about those. We'll discuss detail as we move on. And this will be our central theme today, Goleman's model. And more than the theory, we'll try to look at the practices and understand how we are emotionally